Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and when we last left off with A.P. Hill, he was on the Peninsula in Virginia, with Federal forces bearing down on the Confederate entrenchments. Ambrose Powell Hill and his brigade were 3 miles behind the Confederate main entrenchments when Federal forces began to attack the rebel works. As the blue troops began to gain footholds along the Confederate battle line, the reserves were called forward. Hill's superior, James Longstreet, called for Hill and the brigade to come to the front at once. Dressed in a dark blue blouse, pinched at the waist by his sword, with a sprig of pine attached to his hat, Hill led his men forward toward the sound of battle. When they arrived, they remained behind the front line, strengthening positions there. But around 11 a.m., Longstreet had to do something. If his position got overrun, all of his ammunition and supplies in his divisional wagon train would easily be captured in the muddy roads. He had to buy time. He sent out orders to all of his brigade commanders, Hill included. With bayonets fixed, they pressed through the fields toward a line of trees and thickets. Colonel James Kemper, one of Hill's childhood friends and commander of the 7th Virginia and Hill's brigade, peered through the rain and smoke-filled battlefield, but couldn't identify the troops in his front. He asked Hill who they were. Hill gazed through his field glasses and declared, "Yes, they are Yankees. Give it to them." Dismounted, Hill advanced ahead of his brigade, waving his pistol over his head, looking back over his shoulder and calling on his men to follow. He made a splendid picture of the heroic and gallant soldier that he was. The Virginians pushed back the enemy troops under Joseph Hooker until the enemy retreated to a location of felled trees that gave them great cover. Hill ordered his men to kneel in order to load and fire, and for the next 2 hours, from 45 yards away, the two sides battled, throwing lead into one another's ranks. A private in the brigade wrote, "General Hill came down the line. He stood bolt upright between the contending fires, looked around a while, then went off to the left, returned, looked once more intently into the timber as if to say this nest must be cleaned out." In those moments, Hill was erect, magnificent, the god of war himself, amid the smoke and the thunder. With the ammunition critically low as evening came on, Hill ordered a charge which drove the Federals back, but the successful charge had disorganized his lines and he was forced to pull back in order to regroup. Longstreet would order his division to fall back to the rear after a hard day of fighting. Hill's casualties were 67 killed, 245 wounded, and 14 missing, the highest Confederate brigade loss in the battle. For their losses, they captured 160 Federal soldiers, 7 battle flags, and with the help of the 9th Alabama, 8 pieces of artillery. Hill had fully demonstrated his prowess in battle. He had accepted responsibility, seized the initiative, fought gallantly, and exceeded what was asked of him. On May 15th, Hill and his men moved close to Darbytown as the massive Union Army was making its way up the peninsula. Richmond, the capital of Virginia and the Confederacy itself, was in danger. The call went up to all the states in the Confederacy to help protect the capital, and they began sending troops to Joseph E. Johnston. The influx of troops prompted Johnston to ask Jefferson Davis to allow the creation of more major generals to command all the additional troops streaming into the state. This was allowed, and A.P. Hill was made a major general at the end of May 1862. One of Hill's biographers explained it well when he said, "Hill had entered Confederate service hoping for quick appointment to high command. It had not developed. For 9 months he had gloomily marked time as a colonel, watching chances for glory go to subalterns. Then, in rapid fashion, came brigade command and his first taste of battle. Now the man who wanted to be a general in charge of large numbers of troops, the officer who had led a brigade in but one engagement, found himself at the head of a division. He had jumped from regimental colonel to division major general in precisely 90 days. He would command a large division full of 6 brigades. One of them was commanded by Joseph R. Anderson, a 39-year-old man who had graduated from West Point and was the superintendent of Richmond's Tredegar Iron Works. He would not be with the division long. In 2 months he would leave to oversee ordnance production in Richmond. A brigade of North Carolinians commanded by the Princeton-educated attorney Lawrence Branch was also included in the division. The brigade would go on to achieve great fame in the Army of Northern Virginia and as a part of Hill's division. Hill's South Carolina Brigade, under the colorful lawyer from Columbia, South Carolina, Maxcy Gregg, gave the division commander great joy. Gregg and Hill got along extremely well and was one of the brigade commanders who had free access to Hill. Gregg was an authority on astronomy and was motivated at the beginning of the war to dedicate himself to secession. He would transform in battle from a more quiet gentleman into a hard-battling warrior. Dorsey Pender was another of Hill's brigadiers. The 28-year-old had a thin frame, an olive complexion, a pointed beard, and a kindly expression, even though it did not match his strict sense of discipline. Hill and Pender got along well. Both were ambitious, intense, and loved combat. Pender could be seen in the thick of combat, astride a horse enjoying a cigar as he watched his units in battle. Charles W. Field commanded a brigade of Virginians for Hill. Although he was born in Kentucky, his family roots came from Culpeper like Hill. He graduated from West Point 2 years behind his divisional commander. Field was stocky, congenial, and full of humor. The final brigade in Hill's division was a conglomeration of Tennesseans, Alabamians, and Georgians under James Archer. Archer was a Marylander, graduate of Princeton, and had spent time in the regular army, became a successful attorney, and when war broke out, took command of the 5th Texas. Hill's 9 artillery batteries were commanded by Major Reuben Lindsay Walker. Walker descended from a prominent Virginia family, stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, with long hair, a sweeping mustache, an imperial beard, and piercing black eyes that gave a constant grave expression. He would participate in 63 engagements without suffering injury. After the war, whenever someone would ask him if he had been wounded, he would draw himself up and reply, "No, sir, and it was not my fault." On his staff, he had his brother, Baptist, as his major and commissary, a nephew, Francis T. Hill, as his aide-de-camp, and a brother-in-law, Richard C. Morgan, as one of his assistant adjutants general. Another member of his staff was Murray Forbes Taylor, a VMI cadet who Hill had met training soldiers at Harper's Ferry. A volunteer aide to Hill in the later stages of the Peninsula campaign was John M. Daniel, editor of the Richmond Examiner. One historian described him as tall, with long black locks. His uniform brought back visions of English cavaliers and composed of equal parts cynicism and egotism. It was said he hated the world at large, but loved his few friends with an ardor which shrank at nothing. Few generals in the Civil War were as solicitous of or affectionate toward their men as Hill. In his relations with his brigade and regimental commanders, however, he maintained a polite distance. Hill never referred to any of them by their first name. Embracing a comrade or slapping someone on the back was alien to his nature. Although he did not demand any formality, his presence and aura evoked it, so that, with the exception of Gregg and Pender, his officers were strictly formal with him. Hill's division was intended to attack McClellan's right flank at the end of May and early June, but Johnston changed his mind and had Longstreet attack the other flank at the Battle of Seven Pines from May 31st to June 1st. Johnston would be seriously wounded in that engagement. On June 1st, Hill first used a nickname for his new command. At the top of a brief communique he sent to Branch were the words Headquarters, Light Division. The exact origin and intent of the title are unknown. Possibly Hill wanted his men to have a reputation for agility, or the name may have been nothing more than a kind of joke because it was one of the largest divisions in the Confederate armies. One soldier came to the conclusion that the name was applicable, for we often marched without coats, blankets, knapsacks, or any other burdens except our arms and haversacks, which were never heavy and sometimes empty. The morale in the army dipped when Johnston had to be relieved because of his serious wound. Robert E. Lee was named the commanding general of the army. As one historian described, up until that point, most people associated Lee with being a paper shuffler in Richmond, aside from a foray into what is now West Virginia that did not end well for Lee. On June 2nd, Lee met with his generals. Hill and the rest were pleased with the new commander by the time they left the meeting. Hill himself rode back to the Light Division's headquarters, optimistic about the upcoming campaign.